Matthew chapter 27 is where we've been. We started last week and got through about verse 10 or so. And so we'll pick up here this week and take a look at the story going forward. And as if you remember last week, chapter 27, really in the end of chapter 26, we have the three denials of Peter as Jesus is being tried. And as I mentioned last week, he was tried illegally. They tried him at night, and their system and their laws would have required that he be tried during the day, when witnesses for his behalf could have been present, where everybody in the city could have seen it. They did it at night. They hurried it through, and of course, as I mentioned, they were supposed to sit. The Sanhedrin court was supposed to sit for 3 days to be able to hear anybody in case new evidence or something like that came to light. And of course, they just pushed everything through. Ultimately, when they try him in their own court, and it's important to note for today's lesson, when they tried Jesus in their own court, they find him guilty of what? Blasphemy, right? Because he said that he was God. And so just keep that in the back of your mind, because that's not exactly what they tell Pilate when they bring him to Pilate for Pilate to try him. And so, and one of the reasons that I had you read in Mark, Luke, and John is because, as we mentioned before, so much of this story, and I understand when you read it, there's a lot of moving parts, and anytime you would have something this massive going on with this much of a crowd and this many involved people with it, it would be hard to put every intricate detail on the paper and tell exactly how it all happened. And so you have to kind of take the different accounts, because again, these were men writing, and they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. I believe that with all my heart. But they were writing about their experience, and from where you were standing and where I was standing, there might be different viewpoints when it comes to these things. And so that's why I think you get some of the details in one and not the other. And so to kind of try to piece all of that together, I've tried to, at least in my mind, build the timeline for you so that you can see what's going on. So because everything in chapters 26 and 27 all happen in the span of 8 or 10 hours. Because again, when Jesus is arrested in the garden in the middle of the night, everything from there until he's crucified and they take him down off of the cross the next day happens before sunset the next day. Because if you remember, they had to take him down before the setting of the sun, because they considered that to be a violation of their law to leave him on the cross for Passover. So just understand that's what's gone on. And so they have their illegal trial in the middle of the night, and then the next morning, early morning, just as dawn is breaking, they set the Sanhedrin court. They bring him into the temple court. They have their more official trial before everybody knows what's going on. They find him guilty once again of blasphemy. Keep that in mind. And then they immediately rush him over to where it's just next door to the governor Pilate to have him tried, because the Jews did not have the power of execution. They were under Roman rule and Roman authority, and so if you were going to put somebody to death, you had to have Rome do it. If you were going to do it legally. Now, they stay on the fringes of legality the whole time with what they're doing, and anyway, but just understand. And so, in the beginning of chapter 27, in the first 2 verses, you get that where he's delivered to Pilate, and then last week, the next 8 verses kind of takes a glance away from what's going on with Jesus to look at Judas and what happened to him. And we see that as he begins to struggle with what he's done in betraying Jesus internally, he knows that he's betrayed an innocent man. He says so much. And we understand that even though Judas is sorry for the consequences of his actions, even though Judas is remorseful over the things that he has done, it doesn't bring him to the point of going to the one who can truly forgive him of his sin, and that is that he never calls on Jesus, he never calls on the Lord. And in spite of being sorry, in spite of feeling bad, and you'll get where I'm going with this, those things are not enough. In and of themselves, being sorry and being remorseful and being regretful is not enough to bring you to salvation. He stopped short of truly being sorry to the Lord, of understanding exactly what he did and the gravity of it. And then in a desperate attempt, and I tried to cover this last week, in a desperate attempt to try to, and I think in some ways, and people that study and understand this will tell you that people commit suicide for a lot of different reasons. But one of the primary reasons is for retribution. And what I mean by that is people feel like by doing that to themselves, it in some way pays for the wrong that they have done.
It's a big thing in Japanese culture.
Exactly. And of course, even though Judas did in fact harm himself and did that, it's not a thing that is looked upon as a positive thing by God. And in fact, really and truly, if you think about it, suicide is a direct attack and an affront against the sovereignty of God. Because God determines life and God determines death. And so to try to take that power into our own hands for our own lives is somewhat of an attack against God and His sovereignty over us. And so, again, I'm not going to dwell on that, but it's a sad story, because in the end, someone who walked with Jesus, someone who identified with Jesus, someone who had fellowship with Jesus, someone who constantly spent time, who saw the miracles, who saw what Jesus could do, still in his heart never believed that he was God, never believed that he was the Messiah, and never called or fell on him for salvation. And in the end, he winds up, the Bible says that he went to his own place. And I think that's a sad statement on the life of a man who at once probably looked from a human perspective, looked so promising. And of course, the obvious there is that just like Judas, I think there's many who identify with Jesus, who have an outward apparent relationship with Jesus, who talk about Jesus, who are seen in circles as being one who is associated with Jesus, and yet at the same time they don't know the Lord in the free pardon of sin. And so that's a sad state of affairs. And I think if you study the Bible, this is where a lot of people don't understand. It's not the lost pagans that get the hottest degree of hell. It's those who are exposed to the most truth. And for those that spend most of their time around the truth and yet still never come to salvation, I think the punishment is greater for those than it is for maybe some that we think that the greatest punishment is reserved for. And so again, that's kind of inserted, and I say inserted, that's a moment to look away from what's going on with Jesus, but Matthew covers the fact of what happened to Judas and where his path took him. And so in verse 11 we come back now, and like I say, that's really almost what I would consider a parenthetical there from verses 3 to verse 10, where we talk about Judas. Because verse 1 and 2 talk about the fact that they bound Jesus and took him to Pilate. And then in verse 11 it says, and Jesus stood before the governor. And so that's where we're back to now. Just a brief glance away as Matthew covers what happened to Judas. So Judas is now dead. All of this is happening simultaneously as Jesus is being tried. Now remember, the Jews have tried him. They found him guilty. And they've sent him to Pilate so that they can get him sentenced to death. And again, they're trying to push all of this through illegally. And as I mentioned one more time, just so everybody gets it, they were supposed to try him in the Sanhedrin court, and the Sanhedrin court was supposed to sit for 3 days, 3 full days, so that anybody that wanted to testify on Jesus' behalf could. This is all going to happen in the place of a few hours, and Jesus will be crucified, before lunchtime, even on the same day. So again, the trial was completely illegitimate and illegal according to their laws, but again, they weren't too worried about that unless it's something they wanted to worry about. Exactly. So, they're careful to observe their laws where they want to and not so careful where it doesn't behoove them to. And so I think we read these verses at the end of class last week, but didn't really get to cover them. But it says Jesus in verse 11 stood before the governor, talking about Pilate. And the governor asked him, saying, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" Now, what did they accuse Jesus of? Okay, remember now that the Jews found him guilty of blasphemy. Okay, now if you read the account in Luke and in John, what you'll realize is that that's not what they came to Pilate with and told Pilate. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind. So there's so many stories being spun here. The bottom line is, and I think it's easy to understand that, the Jews are going to get Jesus crucified, and they'll do whatever it takes at this point in time. They have made up their mind. They'll go to any length. They've already paid money and bribed false witnesses. They've already bribed and paid Judas to betray him. All of this has been done by them without any remorse or any regret. And it says that Jesus said unto him, this is Matthew's account of Jesus in front of Pilate. Now, the reason I say, and I've got a few of the verses, but that's why I had you read all of the accounts, you'll realize that actually this interaction with Pilate was quite involved between Pilate and Jesus and the people. And Pilate comes in and out several times, at least 3, maybe 4, best you can tell from all of the accounts, and keeps presenting to the people, hey, look, I don't find anything wrong here. I don't find any fault. What do you want me to do? And Pilate is really trying, just so you understand, he's trying to do anything and everything that he can come up with to keep from having to crucify Jesus. He really does not want to. Okay? And we'll get into the details of that in a minute, but let me keep going with this. He said, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said unto him, "Thou sayest." And again, this is Old English for,
if that's what you say.
Yeah, it's as you say, meaning yes. And again, there's so much behind some of these comments because of the conversations that are in the different Gospels, and I'll try to cover some of that in just a second. But it says, "And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing." And this makes Pilate intrigued, if nothing else. It says he marveled there in verse 14, but it says, "Then Pilate said unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee?" And at this point in time, it's whatever will work. Okay, now remember, they tried him and found him guilty only of blasphemy.
Yeah.
Okay, they take him to Pilate and they're throwing all of these accusations against him. And it says he answered never to him a word. At this point in time, and I think it's worth mentioning, Jesus is absolutely 100% resolute in the fact that he already knows and understands. He's going to the cross.
Yeah.
The trial has already been had, and everything that should have been and needed to be said has been said. They really don't have anything worthy of death. And I think an overarching theme of Matthew, if you really look at it and get into it, is the fact that Matthew is really trying to make sure that we get the idea that Jesus was in fact perfect. Because after all, the testimony of Judas was that I betrayed the blood of what? An innocent man.
Not God.
Yeah, but he was innocent. Okay? And even the priest and the scribes, when Judas threw the money back into the temple, they said, we can't put this money back in the temple because it's the blood money for an innocent man. Their own testimony against Jesus was that he was innocent. They really didn't have anything. And it said he answered never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Okay? And then this is what I was talking about. What did they really accuse him of? Now remember, they found him guilty of blasphemy. But in Luke's account, we see what they're throwing out there at him. It says that the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. Same story, same account. Okay? And they began to accuse him, saying, and this would be this same exact timeline. Okay? Matthew doesn't tell us what they're accusing him of. Luke does. Now look what they're accusing him of. Saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forgiving to pay tribute to Caesar. Now was that anything that they found him guilty of in their trial? No. Because at the end of the day, guess what Caesar doesn't care about? Blasphemy. They got 1,000,000 gods. They don't care what you said about the Jews' God. Okay? The Jews know that they can't take Jesus to Pilate and have him tried in a Roman court and put to death for blasphemy. Because the Romans don't put people to death for blasphemy.
But I remember I read somewhere that some people claim to be a child of Zeus or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but regardless, this is the claim that they're now throwing out. And look at what they say, and this is absolutely totally fabricated. Okay? They said, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Now, not only is that laughable, that's absolutely false, because what did Jesus say when asked about, do you pay tribute?
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Was he forbidding anybody to pay? No, in fact, he told them the opposite. He said,
give him the money.
Give him the money. Pay what you owe. This is an absolute fabrication and lie, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. And what they're saying there is,
he's threatening your throne.
Exactly. In other words, they're accusing him of an insurrection. There's a buzzword these days, okay? But understand, this would get you tried and found guilty and executed in a Roman court.
Yeah.
Because there were many who had tried. Understand, okay? And there's two things that are comical about this. One is the fact that this is an absolute lie and contradictory to what Jesus actually said or taught ever. The other is the fact that the Jews absolutely hated Rome. They hated being under Roman authority. And there were many people who tried by many different means to raise insurrections and coups against the Roman government and to overthrow the Roman government. And the Jews were in favor of all of these. So the last thing that the Jews would have actually done is to turn somebody in to Pilate who was trying to hurt or harm the Roman government. They would never have come and said, hey, this guy's trying to cause trouble in your... They wanted that. They wanted to be out from under Rome. And in fact, in 70 AD, when they slaughtered all the Jews, destroyed the temple, and basically ended the Jewish nation as anyone knows it up until 1948, the whole reason was because of a series, years after years after years, of these insurrections and uprisings, and they were constantly having to send in troops and try to squash all of these rebellions and things like that, and it was causing real trouble. And finally Rome got to the point where they said, all right, we've had enough of this, and they went in and they completely destroyed them. So that's the reason that it even happened to begin with. So the fact that they're here accusing Jesus of this and trying to get him tried for treason against Rome is just almost hilarious. that's saying that he is Christ, and so Jesus is accused of trying to set himself up as a king and trying to go against Rome. That's what they're now accusing him of. Mind you, they didn't find him guilty of any of that in their own trial. This is just whatever will work and whatever sticks. And understand, in all of this, okay, Pilate is going to take Jesus and question him several times, and you have to go to John to see some of the questioning, because Pilate asked Jesus, okay, what's the deal? Are you a king? Meaning, are you trying to usurp the power and the authority of Rome? And Jesus in John says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my servants would fight for me. Okay? And after that whole conversation in John, and you can read it, I think it's John 19, Pilate comes out and says, I find no fault in him. He's not a threat to Rome. He's not trying to overthrow. That's the idea here. But back to Matthew. In verse 15, now this is after some conversation, and like I say, you have to go and put all of the pieces together. Pilate's getting down to the end. Okay? He's running out of options. Okay? He really doesn't want to what they're asking him to do, which is crucify Jesus.
Sees no issue with him.
Exactly.
Respects him.
And here's the thing. Now look. Pilate was not the most noble man. But they did in Rome, at least to some extent, have somewhat of a free and honest society and government. It has its caveats, I know, but there was at least a sense of justice and equality in judgment for the people. And so for Pilate to be in the position that he was in, he had to at least have some respect for what was right and what was wrong in a judicial sense. Okay? So Pilate understands that there's really nothing here. And he really doesn't want to be in this position. But let me give you some background story. And the Jews are going to use it against Pilate in order to get him to do what they want to do, even though he really doesn't want to do it. Because Pilate actually, though yes, Pilate has power, Pilate's a governor, Pilate's not Caesar. Okay? He has people over him. And actually, Pilate has already caused some issues with his being in charge in Jerusalem from the get-go. And so he's kind of on shaky ground. Because what happened was, when Pilate was given that governorship, when he came to power in that region, when he marched into town with all of these fancy flags and fanfare that the Romans did. Well, the Jews saw all of these emblems of the Roman eagle and all of the other emblems on these staves made out of gold as idols. Okay, and if there's one thing, now I will say this, if there's one thing the Jews actually finally learned when they were carried off into Babylon, it was not to have idols and false gods. There's a lot of problems and a lot of issues that plagued the Jews from that point on, but idols were not one of them. They really learned their lesson on that, and even to this day, they will not have any emblems or symbols or any deity-looking idols. But Pilate came in and did that. Well, the Jews and the people just came in an absolute uproar and chased him out of town and yelled and screamed and hollered, and they had to bring in troops and settle everything down, and they had to make Pilate take all of these things. So Rome was already like aggravated at the fact that Pilate had done this and has caused all of this issues and stuff. And so what Pilate knows is that he's on thin ice. And if he causes another uproar and another issue, he's probably going to be removed from his position of power. Okay? And it was not uncommon for people in power like that caused issues and caused problems when they were removed from their position of power, to not just be removed from their position of power, but to be removed from this life. If you get what I'm saying. It was just the way they operated. It's a fancy, nice position, but it came with consequences if you caused issue.
Much is given, much is also
Exactly.
required.
Even the world sometimes has those principles, and so just understand that's what's going on. So Pilate does not want to crucify Jesus. He does not want to execute Jesus. He knows that there's nothing there that makes him worthy of this punishment, and at the same time, though, the last thing he wants to do is to cause an issue and to cause an uproar and get himself in trouble. So one of the other things that happened in the midst of all of this, because the Jews are crying out, hey, we want him crucified, you crucify him. He's gone about all, and again, you can read this account in John, he's gone about through all the regions and in Galilee preaching. And it says that when Pilate heard Galilee, he thought, is he a Galilean? And they said, yes. And he said, he's in Herod's territory. So Jesus actually sends him to Herod, or Pilate actually sends Jesus to Herod for a little while. Herod questions him. The Bible said Herod was actually excited because he wanted to see him do a miracle, because he had heard about all the miracles and stuff. And when Jesus wouldn't do what he wanted him to do and wouldn't say anything, Herod basically sent him back to Pilate and said, here, you deal with him. I don't want to deal with it. Again, he said, Herod's testimony was, I don't find anything worthy of death. You deal with it. So he bowed back.
Take the fall.
Exactly. Nobody wants to do that. Again, it goes to prove the point that Jesus truly was innocent. If there had been something there, Pilate here wouldn't have thought twice about it. It wouldn't have even mattered to them. But they knew that he was innocent. And so now, after all that, Herod sends him back. Pilate's running out of options. He's trying his absolute best to get out of having to do this. And it says now, at the feast, the governor was wont, and this is meaning that it was typical that this is what was done, to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. And this had become kind of a customary thing at the Feast of Passover, as kind of an olive branch of peace, if you will, from Rome to the Jews, that at their Passover feast, they would release one prisoner that they had, that Rome had in their prisons from the nation of Israel, whoever they picked, and they would just release that prisoner and basically pardon that prisoner. And so this was typical. So Pilate's thinking of anything and everything he can possibly think of. And so Pilate thinks about this, that it's that time and he can do this. And in verse 16 it says that they had a notable prisoner called Barabbas. And of course, if you look, and this is what's funny about this, the very thing that the Jews accused Jesus of, this man was actually guilty of. It tells us in one of the other Gospels, I can't remember which one right offhand, but that he was an insurrectionist and that he had led an insurrection and committed murder in the process. And in one of the other Gospels it says that he was also a robber. This is not a nice guy. Basically, Pilate goes and finds the absolute worst possible prisoner that he can find, the most horrible, wretched prisoner and offender that he can find, so that he can put him up against Jesus, because his hope is that if he can find somebody bad enough and put him up against it, they're not going to let this guy just walk. And yet, at the same time, their hatred for Jesus is such that it wouldn't have mattered who Pilate put up there. Mm-hmm. They were out for one thing and one thing only. And it says, so this man was called Barabbas. he was an insurrectionist, he was a murderer. Those are all attributes given to him in the different Gospels. It says, therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, whom will ye that I release unto you? Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? He said, which one? It's customary. It's that time. I'll release one of them to you. They'll be free to go. You pick. And it says, and this is Pilate's testimony here. It says, for he knew that for envy they had delivered him. Pilate knows there's nothing there. Pilate knows the Jews are doing this because they're envy for the Lord. They wanted to be the religious leaders. They wanted to be the ones in charge. They wanted to be the ones in power. They had built for themselves a really nice system, and he was here messing it up. And he could do all of the things that they wanted to be able to do. They wanted to be able to have the power to take care of people and to do all of these things so that they could amass to themselves more of those subjects and people that followed them. And yet Jesus did this just in passing. And so we see here that he knows this. And in verse 19, going forward, it says that when he was sat down on the judgment seat, and this would have been a literal seat that he would sit on, and it means that he is acting with the full authority of Rome behind him. Notice what happens here. That while he's on this judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, have thou nothing to do with this, what's that next phrase? Just man. Everybody involved in this knows and understands that Jesus is just, Jesus is innocent, Jesus is perfect. He's never done anything. And she says, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Now, what maybe we don't see that's happening here in our minds is that this whole, his wife sent unto him, this would have been by way of a messenger. This is happening at the same time that Pilate is saying, which one do you want? Barabbas or Jesus? And it looks and appears like what happens right here is that this message coming and interrupting Pilate from Pilate's wife gives the Jews just enough time to move through the crowd and tell everybody and persuade the crowd, hey, ask for Barabbas. Okay? Because again, this is all happening simultaneously, but it says that his wife sent him a message saying, have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. And it says, but the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude. So I think this gave them just enough time to move through the crowd and persuade enough people that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And this is absolutely amazing, because the crowd that has gathered at this point in time is no doubt some of the same crowd that was throwing olive branches and palm leaves down in the road 3 days earlier and saying, hail and Hosanna and glory to God in the highest, for the King is here. And now they're saying, yeah, give us Barabbas.
We'll take the murderer and the robber.
Yeah. Over this.
Over the guy we call King and God.
Exactly. And so, but again now, you have to look at all, and it's tough to get this whole picture. But you have to remember, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, you have to know and understand what most of the Jews were looking for in their Messiah. And they were looking for somebody to overthrow the Roman government and deliver the Jews from their oppression. And now you have Pilate, who, when they accuse Jesus and have him tried in front of Pilate for insurrection and for trying to overthrow the Roman government and for trying to be king, Pilate comes back and says, I don't find him guilty of any of that. A lot of them would have looked at that and said, well, then he's definitely not the Messiah, because that's what he would have done. There's a million reasons, but that's just possibly some. But either way, the priests persuade the people, and they say, give us Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, whether of the twain will I release unto you? He's trying. It's almost like, are you sure you want Barabbas? And they said, yeah, Barabbas. And so instead of Jesus, they asked for the murderer, the robber, the insurrectionist, this horrible individual who was guilty of many, many, many horrible crimes. And with that being said, look at the question here. Now, he just said, all right, which one you want, Jesus or Barabbas? They said, give us Barabbas. He said, all right, think about it. Which one do you really want, Jesus or Barabbas? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith to them, what shall I do with Jesus? Again, given every opportunity here.
You got 2 for 1 offer here. I can let him go too.
What? Yeah, again, okay, I'll let Barabbas go. What do you want me to do with Jesus? He's still not guilty of anything. He said, what shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They say unto him, let him be crucified. And the governor said, why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, let him be crucified. And when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but rather a tumult was made, and this means almost a riot, an uproar. And this is what's going to get it done right here. Because remember what I told you, the only thing that Pilate could not afford for to happen was for there to be another uprising of the people that Rome had to send in soldiers and handle, because he knew that would most likely cost him his position and possibly even his life. It says that when he could prevail nothing, but rather a tumult was made, he took water, and this of course is the famous account here. This was symbolic. This would have been something that they would have been accustomed to seeing in situations like this. But it said that he took water and he washed his hands before the multitude. And again, this is strictly symbolism on Pilate's part, but he's showing them here his heart on the matter is that I don't find anything wrong with him. There's nothing here to make it worthy of crucifying him. It says he took the water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this. And what's his commentary on Jesus? Just person. Again, Pilate's findings over and over. I find no fault. I find no fault. I find nothing wrong.
This is nothing wrong with this.
Yes.
Why?
This is a just man. His wife said, "Don't have anything to do with this just man." The overarching theme of Matthew is on the perfection of Jesus, and here we see it playing out and displayed so many times. The fact that there really was nothing to find him guilty of. Even in man's court, there was nothing to find Jesus guilty of. And he says, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person. See you to it, or you deal with him. Basically what Pilate's saying is, I'm not doing anything. You do it. Okay? He's still at this point trying to get out of having to do what he's fixing to have to do. Okay, and again, you have to go to the other Gospels to get the full account, because this is the point at which the Jews cry out, hey, if you won't do it, then you're no friend of Caesar. And that caught his attention, because between the commotion that is being made, the near riot mentality, this mob mentality that is going on, and them saying, hey, if you won't do this, if you won't put this man to death, then you're no friend of Caesar. Basically accusing him of taking part in this supposed uprising against the authority of Caesar. That's what's going on at this point in time. Okay? And so we see here that then answered all of the people and said, and this is one of those instances where you better be careful what you say, because this is exactly what happened. The people said, no. He said, you let his blood be on us and on our children.
You idiots.
Yeah. And it was. And it won't be covered in Matthew's gospel. But Jesus actually preaches his last sermon as he is on the way to the mountain to be crucified. When the woman weeping for him, Jesus tells her, don't weep for me. Weep for you and weep for your children. He said, because there will come a day where it will be said, blessed are they who don't have any children. And I'm paraphrasing. Because it would be better not to have children. There will be a day when you'll cry out for the fact that your children are alive because they're being killed. And that day would eventually come in 70 AD. It was horrible, horrible slaughter. Right? They did not use discretion. Rome was so tired of their antics and so tired of their uprisings. They killed women, they killed children. If you were a Jew, Rome was executing you. It was a horrible experience, and truly partial judgment. Now, understand, final judgment doesn't come until Judgment Day, but partial judgment was rendered on the nation of Israel for what they did to Jesus when they had him crucified. And so when they said that, they didn't understand what they were asking for, but they're guilty. And they are they still, and this is what displays God's grace and God's love, because even though, yes, to this day, who's guilty of having Jesus crucified? It was the Jews, okay? There's no question about it. They're the ones that put him there. Just understand that God is still going to save nation Israel in part, and that even after this whole story, if you look in the book of Acts, it talks about the fact that because it was told them in the book of Acts, look, you crucified the Lord of glory. And many of them came and said, what do we do? And the apostles told them, you repent. And you'll be baptized and you'll be forgiven. And many of the Jews actually came. It even says in the book of Acts that many of the priests. So it wasn't that all of them. There were actually some of the priests even that came to a faith in Jesus Christ after this. So it's amazing to me that God's capacity for forgiveness, when we think about our own human capacity, when the people that are doing these things to him are later people, some of them are going to be saved and some of them are going to wind up serving the Lord with their lives. It's just incredible.
The very God that
Exactly. It's no different than the Roman centurion, and I'm getting ahead of myself, that helps nail Jesus to the cross. When he sees everything that is done, the Bible says that he glorified God and said, surely this was the Son of God. And even though all that being done, Jesus was still willing to forgive and still bringing about salvation. It's incredible that he has that capacity to love and to forgive. But anyway, it says, then released he, and this is again, he has been forced all the way to the end here to do what he doesn't want to do. It says, then released he Barabbas unto them. He said, all right, fine. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now Matthew's commentary here is very concise. There's not a lot here because immediately they're going to take him and do what they do to him. But there's a lot that goes on here in between those two verses, again, when you read all of the gospel accounts. This is very concise here. Matthew does not so much focus on all of the other people involved. Again, Matthew is trying to show that Jesus is perfect. So it says that his blood be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. But there's actually some time span right there. Because what you don't realize is that in the meantime, Pilate sends Jesus. He says, all right, I'm going to have him scourged. Okay? And so they do, in fact, and it's described in some of the other Gospels. Here's John's account. It says that Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. And you go back to Luke, and it says that the whole band of soldiers, basically this was the Roman way of the initial part of crucifixion. They would take the person, they would strap them to a post and extend their arms up above their head so that their body was taut and stretched out. And then we all know the story. They took the cat o' nine tails. But it says that basically a whole group of soldiers gathered around and whipped Jesus. The Bible talks about and of course those instruments were leather, multi-laced leather straps with bone and glass and various pottery that was sharpened and made to lacerate and to mutilate. Okay. And they laid him open to the point the Bible says that literally you could see his insides and they were trying to fall out through the holes. Pilate does all of this. Okay. It says that they mocked him, they put the crown of thorns on his head. And this again, now these are ignorant men. These are Roman soldiers. They don't know about the Jews. They don't know about Messiah. They don't know about any of that. Okay? These are just Roman soldiers doing Roman soldier stuff. But they're making fun and they're mocking Jesus. And this whole thing of putting the crown of thorns on his head is a mocking of him being king. Because Caesar would have worn the you see it in all the pictures with the leafy crown of
Weren't the thorns like about this long?
and some have said that. Now the Bible doesn't tell us. We don't know what kind of thorn bush it was. But the idea being the whole thing was a mockery. The crown was made out of this thorn thing that nobody would ever make a crown out of. Again, it was a disrespectful thing. They platted it says, which means they slammed it down on Jesus' head, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." This is all in making fun and mocking Jesus. This is laughing at him. This is spitting in his face.
They're being bullies.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very mild way of putting it. But it shows, and we got to be done here in just a second, but it shows at least from one perspective, and that would be the ignorant and lost. And there's several groups of people represented here. You have the religious lost in the Jews, and you have the secular or the worldly lost, the ignorant lost that really don't know anything about Jesus. And they're here, they're making fun of this man. But look what it says here in verse 4, and we'll try to finish this and be done. It says, Pilate therefore went forth again and said unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you. Now Pilate scourged him and actually takes him and brings him back out, and it says that you may know that I find no fault in him. So this is like the fourth time now. Exactly. And so Pilate's thinking here is that if I rough him up enough and show him to you, you'll say, okay, fine, that's good enough. He's still trying to get out of having to crucify Jesus, because it says, I'm bringing him to you. Look at, behold. Behold mean in that terminology means, hey, take a good hard look at this. And so he says that ye may know that I find no fault in him. One more time, just letting them know, I still don't find anything worthy of death. It says, then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate saith unto them, behold the man. Again, Pilate's here, the idea being, take a good hard look. And I think in Pilate's mind and in Pilate's heart, he was hoping against all hope that this would have been enough. That they would have said, okay, all right, he's learned his lesson, let him go. We understand and know that's not the case. And so they're in the other gospel, it says that they just cried out the louder, crucify him, crucify him. And finally, and this is where, and I think it would haunt Pilate, after all was said and done, knowing what happened, knowing what was done, I think it would haunt Pilate for the rest of his life. And history says, now whether the Bible doesn't say it, doesn't matter. History says that Pilate eventually pretty much went mad and committed suicide. I think it's very plausible, because I think probably it haunted Pilate for all of his days, because while he tried, at the end of the day, he was not willing to go far enough to say, I don't care what you say, I'm not doing it. Because he was in the interest of self-preservation, in the interest of quieting what was going on and being done with it. Pilate commits what he has already testified at least 4, maybe 5 times through the Gospels to be an innocent man. He says, okay, fine, crucify him. He can wash his hands all he wants to. At the end of the day, it's not the Jews that can give the order, it's Pilate. And Pilate says, away with him, crucify him. And it's his word, it's his order, and I think for the rest of Pilate's life, I think that haunted him, that he in fact did, at the end of the day, crucify an innocent man. Now I don't know, I can't prove, again, I don't know. But just understand, that's where we're at. And the rest of chapter 27 is going to be about the whole crucifixion process. And so we'll get to that next week. Thank y'all for being here. I am done.